what I've learned is that, and it goes back to this hip hop connection, growing up with that understanding of hip hop, I've had a passport to every community I've ever stepped foot on that transcended my U.S. passport or any other official title or role. I've been able to land on any street in the world, whether even an MS-13 community in San Salvador, land in the street, look up, and find my people and find a way and just connect.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today's guest is Anchorage Assembly member for East Anchorage, George Martinez. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, George was part of the hip-hop community from an early age and made a name for himself as a rapper and lyricist. Growing up in the 80s, he was politicized by the anti-welfare rhetoric of President Reagan's administration. That experience eventually led him to run for political office, and he was elected as the district leader in the 51st Assembly District in Sunset Park, Brooklyn in 2002, making him the first hip-hop artist elected to a political office in New York. He is a former adjunct professor at Pace University, where he taught American politics and his own self-developed course, The Politics of Hip Hop. In 2007, he served as cultural ambassador for the U.S. State Department in the Western Hemisphere, under Secretary of State at the time, Colin Powell. We talk about how he and his family got to Anchorage, his 4 years serving in Ethan Berkowitz Mayoral administration, and his experience now on the Anchorage Assembly. But since, in 2013, he was named a 40 under 40 Rising Latino Star of New York by the Hispanic Coalition of New York, here's a taste of George "Rhythm" Martinez's 2011 hit Occupation Freedom about the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Yeah. Sometimes all we need is a spark. Set it off. I take money from the rich and invest it in the poor. Been a long time coming, time we settle the score. You can do it for your people, but I do it for your all. And yes, I got mines covered and I never let them fall. When the real hits the fan, son, who you gonna call? Not Ron Paul, more like the honorable Rhythm Martinez with a team of superheroes. Walk throughout the land for my team of super zeros. Add it up, come back with negative ignitements of a system that starts out positive enlightenment.
Now for the interview.
Well, George Martinez, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
So tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York.
And I've read your bio. I understand you grew up with a single mom. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your childhood and how it all happened?
Sure. And you know, it's funny when people say they're from New York, I always ask, like, when did you leave? Because that'll tell me a little bit about their background. I grew up and was raised in New York City. Grew up as a child of a single mother. We were on, public assistance. My father was around, but there was like that, what we now know is one of those ACEs scores where like that family tension and those family dynamics. We didn't have language for that back in the day.
Were they ever together while they had you?
Probably during their divorce was when we were very small, 2-3 years old, and I even have recollections of those proceedings and all of the stress and arguments and like violence in the home, and so it was a very tough kind of environment in the house. But you know, growing up in Brooklyn, in New York City, it presents its own challenges and obstacles. But you know, from my vantage point, I had just the richness of all those experiences growing up. I have an older sister, and now, I'm married for 20. Next year will be my 20th year of being married. So, I'm married now longer than my parents were married to each other at any one point in time. But I take those experiences early from that urban setting and kind of the difficulty of coming through poverty and seeing how education was my, opportunity. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school directly and then go on to college and pursue a whole different pathway.
So did you have a good relationship with your mom's side of the family? Were their grandparents involved?
No.
No?
Yeah, no, we actually grew up without grandparents, from my recollection. They were around, but everyone's relationships were really estranged and challenged. My mother's still alive. She lives in Puerto Rico now. She's a widow.
Is she she's Puerto Rican?
Yeah, my family is Puerto Rican descent. And so we're
Both
called,
sides?
Yeah, we're called New Yorkers. And I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I learned Spanish a little in school, but really when I lived overseas after I left New York City, and later on in life I started traveling abroad and lived overseas. But no, in New York City I had cousins and community, right? So my family was more likely to be people that we called cousins, even non-blood cousins, friends, and homeboys. That kind of community network. And some of those folks today I still stay connected to. But my experiences in New York really shaped who I was, because I got exposed to just the world, just the diversity of languages, the diversity of people and culture. That great melting pot really informed me of kind of a global perspective of people and diversity.
So you said your dad was around, so you had a relationship with him. It just wasn't very close.
As close as I could have, separate from like the family drama of parents not, having a real difficult relationship. I mean, the funny part of that story is that as I got older, I became my parents' marriage counselor. See, they were divorced for 20 years, but they were hovering around each other for all that time. So they weren't together through those years, but they were always in proximity. And
it sounds like in a not very cordial, friendly manner.
Not in a healthy way. So as I got into a place, I started giving counseling advice. And my best advice, I've taken this into the world perspective too, especially into politics, is I sat my parents down. They were still divorced. And I said to them, and this is probably, I'm 17, 18, said to them, you're both pain in the asses, and no one's going to put up with either one of you independently. So you've been hovering around the other pain in the ass for this long, and you've been hovering around the other pain in the ass for this long. Obviously, no one else wants you guys. You need to get it together now, because you're all you have. You're all you have left. So you made it.
Did they hear that?
They heard it and got remarried to each other.
Oh my!
So my parents got remarried after like 7.
So when you were in like a senior in high school,
they were getting remarried to each other.
Was that a happy marriage?
It was. No. Coming to the realization of who they were and what they were going to do, first of all, seeing kind of clarity of people's dynamics and different opportunities. I've always had that as a gift, so I offered it to them. They took advantage of that, and it didn't change who they were, but it gave them a new starting point, right? So a lot of times people think, how could I have back what I lost? And the reality is that's never possible. Life always changes. The moment we move past something in that moment, it's never the same again. And so you could only have what is new, what is the next version, if you will, of maybe even a long-standing relationship. So I always kind of encourage them to have that perspective. And they got married and stayed to my father's passing. He died pretty young. But yeah, so I came from broken home, never thought I wanted to get married, to a space where I'm celebrating my 20th anniversary.
Right. Were you interested in politics as a teenager?
Well, my first interest in politics was, I grew up in the hip hop culture. So the first two lenses of my political awokeness, if you will, was the Republicans of the Ronald Reagan era talking about the welfare moms and the culture of poverty, and saying that, poor people were deviant, basically, and if they just had better culture, they could be part of America. Just, not talking about any of the barriers, the challenges, systemic racism, just, of course, blaming the victim. And which, when I remember hearing that distinctly on the news, and broadcast news, and thinking to myself, as I remember debating with my sister in the supermarket earlier in the afternoon, who was going to pay with food stamps, because my sister was embarrassed to pay with food stamps, but I didn't know. That's what we were doing. And so then I would see on the news them talking about the welfare moms, which is essentially, you're talking about my mom. So I took it very personal when I heard the Republicans and talking about the welfare mothers. And they just want to have more kids so they can just feed off the system. And they don't work. Never seen.
We still hear those arguments now.
Shit, man, never seen the gray areas of the truth of people's lived experience. So I knew then, I thought to myself, who are these people that they get to sit and talk about things? What power do they have that they get to shape outcomes for my family, and they don't know anything about where I'm from? So that was, one day I will get to be in a position where we will knock those people out. I always felt that, like, some energy about that. And then that meets hip hop, which is, we're gonna take a sidewalk and transform a sidewalk into a dance studio with a cardboard box. We're gonna take old records and remix it. We're gonna change styles and fashions and just kind of see the world very differently. So, like, I took that into politics with me.
Did you have a specific role in hip hop culture? And
oh yeah,
what were you doing?
Yeah. I'm a pioneer in the hip hop community. I'm the if not one of the, guaranteed one of the first elected officials from the hip hop community as an artist. So I'm an MC, long standing, had a career as an artist. I've released music, published as an author as well. I've served as a hip hop ambassador for the United States of America. But when I first started organizing politically, I ran for office in New York City because of the same challenge, the same look up, see who's in the way, and from my just grassroots community perspective, say, let's go talk to those in power to see if what we say is the constitutional right to petition our government for redress of our grievances. So let's go do that. And then when they're not responsive, I took that hip hop flavor and said, well, man, if we could throw a block party and a jam, we can organize politically. And I started to connect that cultural energy of hip hop organizing and hip hop flavor into early voter registration drives and advocacy movements out of New York City. So I started real early on with those two energies that were most available to me, and with a city that was oppressive to young people of color. You know, I was illegally stopped and frisked more than a dozen times as a teenager under Rudolph Giuliani's New York.
Broken windows,
but the aggressive, beat them up, see the black and brown kids and just grab them and stop them and frisk them for no reason and harass them. And that, you know, I grew up with that. So that pressure and that powder keg, we released it creatively in calls to see the world differently through our creative selves. And that really is how hip hop and inspired me to get involved in politics.
I'm going to make one little throwback. So we had a previous guest a couple of weeks ago, Anna Hutchinson, and one of the things that she said was that people are afraid to get involved in politics because they think that there's some sort of secret code. But she's like, what I say is that if people have organized a bake sale, they can organize a political fundraiser. And I kind of hear what you're saying is if you can organize a block party, you can organize a political movement.
It's even go a step further than that. Watch. I mean, and I mentioned this, like, hip hop is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. This is a culture that started off with black and brown kids in the streets of New York City saying, like the story of Horton, the movie The Horton and Whoville, kids in that product, that pressure of the urban environment saying, we exist, we're here, and create the spaces that we were going to be safe in from the violence of the system, the violence of poverty, the violence of gangs and drugs. So we forged. The party wasn't just we organized the party. It was forging a space where we can be safe and then express our creative energy. We doing that because we're creative and we're fly. But the act of doing that in and of itself is political power. Forging a space through the violence of the political violence of systems that were oppressive and targeting us. So when we see that, even just organizing, like getting people together is, that's a skill. We did it. We were changing and creating real spaces. And that's the power that, even beyond understanding it's political, it's that our cultural power is translated into politics when we target it through voter registration and political literacy, so that we can see the changes we want to see in like structures. Mm-hmm. But we forge the spaces independent of that. And that's what's really beautiful about people also not waiting for government to make change that reflects the changes we want to see. Because that's my point. We didn't wait. In fact, everybody was against hip hop. I remember that. The government was against us. The president of the United States was talking shit.
I remember.
Everybody was against
us. Do you still have a role in the music industry, or do you still, can you talk a little bit how you're still connected?
Yeah, well, I mentioned the different roles I've had as a cultural ambassador, but like the United States of America appointed me as a cultural envoy with the Department of State, and I did diplomacy missions.
Yeah, I saw this in your bio. You got to explain this to us. Yeah.
So, and this is the thing about hip hop. It's like we're not just talking about the music, right? We're literally talking about a culture that has these multiple elements, and I'll bring it to Anchorage though. Just this weekend past, I sat down with a group of local creative young people who are dancers. Mm-hmm. Graffiti and graphic folks, but people who represent this hip hop element right here in this community. And that's the cool thing about this intergenerational relationship between our cultural connection, that I could sit in a room with 14, 15-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and we all can see each other and find each other today. So that's pretty exciting to me. As a hip hop artist, I've translated it into education, so I've become a political science professor, and I've taught for 20 years, and have developed curriculum around the political development of hip hop, and overlaid that with like global and political movements, so you can see how the civil rights era infused values and created the opportunity for young Black and brown kids in New York City to find the tools and tell a story that was an advocacy story, essentially, but became a business later on. So with the State Department, I traveled. One of the most important things we can do is help connect, as bridge builders, civil society. So before you want to encourage development and economic development in underdeveloped nations, before we talk about democracy building, my goal is, and has always been focused on, how do we interact with the youth so that we are learning and informing at the same time what healthy relationships could look like. Mm-hmm. And through a hip hop perspective, like people have the industry, and there's a lot of misogyny, there's a lot of negative images that go through the industry, but from a cultural perspective, you can find a kid that's been exposed to the drum, the universality of a hip hop rhythm in Chocó, Colombia, in close to FARC territory, historically heavy area of the world. And they're dancing, they're imagining, and they're being as creative as we were in the 80s and the 90s in Brooklyn today in that part of the world. So for me, it's been about, as a diplomat, been about connecting to those young people, letting them know they're not alone. There is a global culture that informs, that they can look into and tap into and learn about tools that they can bring back to their community from that global knowledge base and remix their world and have fun doing it.
There's been a lot of cultural criticism about Madonna and Eminem, about the sort of like white people sort of appropriating aspects of the culture and mainstreaming it. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah,
hip hop is for everybody. Hip hop is the global connector. I published a book called The Organic Globalizer. Hip hop, the political development of hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially it says that the elements of hip hop are so global that every culture knows them because they have a root in their culture too.
Mm-hmm.
So a drum is a drum is a drum no matter where it is in the world. A bard, Shakespearean storyteller, is an African griot, is the MC.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone can access it. Now, it was black and brown kids that uniquely forged early on understandings of how to bring some of these elements together. But in different elements, depending on the element, there's a different history line. So like the graffiti element of hip hop, a lot of the graffiti element that we recognize comes out of white kids. Mm-hmm. That had different access to resources, but that had the same exposure to an urban environment that saw similar opportunity. So there's always been everybody at the table. And it is for everybody, the hip-hop culture. Eminem, Madonna, they don't create the industry. They're artists. Mm-hmm. There are industry pressures and corporate pressures. Part of the interesting thing is that the level of exploitation is incredible. So that, we didn't create a culture that was hope. We didn't try to create a culture of hip hop just from the streets of New York to travel the world to become rich. We were literally, like I said, creating a space of our safety to survive. Mm-hmm. And it became fresh. It became interesting. And it blew up. Okay, that's awesome. And I've had a career and a journey into those spaces.
Well, and that part of that's just being in New York. And what people say all the time is that, all types of industries, if you are the most creative person ever, but you're living in Kansas, you're probably not going to run into the right people.
More often than not, right.
Whereas in New York, the chances of you running into the right people is much higher because
by
a lot
accident.
of the right people are there.
You did by accident. Man, Wu-Tang Clan is one of the most iconic rap groups of all time. And they're not even old school. They're like middle old school. They're still around. Yeah, I happen to be an artist working with producers who, when we were going to visit the studio one day in New York City, one of the studios, called the Firehouse, this group from Staten Island was in there recording their single, the front and the A and the B side of the two first songs. And the first song was called Protect Your Neck, and the second song was Method Man, METHO. And these kids were talking about Shaolin and this, that, next thing. And I was like, oh man, this was because I was associated with a different flavor. And I remember seeing them in the studio, listening to it and thinking to myself, oh, that's cool. I don't get it though. Next year they were getting big. 2 years later, they were in New York. It was dominating New York City. 25 years later from them, they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Wu-Tang Clan. Yeah. So that's by accident.
And you just happened to be there.
Hanging out, and you bumped into other people along the way. But then I was notable in my lane, so that when I got appointed by the State Department, that's not a job application. That was a call from the community to say who can do this work, and I had distinguished myself different from an artist. Just exclusively because I was already bringing it into the academy, bringing it into political organizing in a way that was different than the industry's focus. And but no, it's all very exciting. That what the funny part is that in this city when I ran for office, there was some of the far right folks that targeted me used. Or attempted to use my hip hop roots, as like a negative,
right?
And I remember saying,
backfired.
Hard work trumps all those crazy narratives. So I work hard in the community, but I was thinking to myself, what year is it? Like what year do you think?
Well, they're not in touch with the current moment. Yeah. You ran for office in New York City. What'd you run for?
I ran for different things, man. I have bum rushed and organized, but I was elected as a Democratic district leader for an assembly district in Brooklyn.
Wow.
And I was late in my 20s.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
Well, it was all,
And I guess talk a little bit about running for office in your late 20s.
Sure. I mean, for me, early politics was really about speaking truth to power in a way that I just recognized I represented a segment of the community that was not being heard. They were often being spoken about by people in power. And even in New York, by people that looked like me, often. But at a certain point, they were still missing a lot of elements of what the community's lived experience was. So I always kind of felt that I was a champion to help other people get engaged. And sometimes, I have a lyric in a song, sometimes all we need is a spark. And so, I've served as a spark and have organized in that way and have utilized the electoral process to educate and inform and to build political power. Matter of fact, I was just talking with, or communicating on Facebook this morning with a friend who's been in the state senator for a decade in New York. And he was one of my best men at my wedding. And as we went to school together, there's so many friends that have done remarkable things there. I always felt that I was the diplomacy and really expanding from New York was more my journey than staying and drilling down into New York. Mm-hmm. So I always felt at a certain point I would. So when I started traveling, it was more natural for me to want to leave out of New York. I felt I had a lot of experiences, but I'm from local to congressional. I pushed the needle and was involved in grassroots organizing, Occupy Wall Street. I was in New York at that particular time, and heavily involved in that whole.
That's interesting. So you met your wife in New York
on a blind date in New York. Yeah, 27 years ago.
Oh, tell us about the blind date.
Oh man,
who set you up? How'd that
an artist named Destiny. So literally, Destiny introduced me to my wife. There was a girl named Destiny at a club. She was interested in one of my cousins who was singing at performing that night. So she came over to ask me for my cousin's information, and then she said, matter of fact, I have a friend that is interested in your type, and I said, all right, man, give him my number. That's a very New York thing to do, and that was like a Friday. She called me on a Sunday. We met on Monday after work type of thing, and we have been hanging out ever since. Literally.
And how long after that did y'all get married?
7 years. I was a hard one. No, yeah.
So y'all dated a long time.
We dated, hung out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I got it. 27 years together, about to celebrate your 20th anniversary.
20th year married, yes. Mm-hmm. And we have a 14-year-old. We have an adopted 10-year-old. Yeah.
How did y'all end up in Alaska?
I first got exposed to Alaska in 2007. When I was traveling as an envoy for the State Department, I was visiting universities all across I would mostly visit universities across the United States and do diplomacy missions. They were all international. So that's how I was earning a living. And I was touring.
So I'm backing up a little bit. Being the envoy for the State Department, the ambassador, was that through George W. Bush? Or
I got appointed during the Bush administration, served during the last year of the Bush administration. Colin Powell was the Secretary of State. That's correct. Mm-hmm. So when the first time I showed up at an embassy, I think my very first diplomacy mission was in 2007 to Bolivia. And, it's like, I think I was there the week of the birthday of Che.
Oh, wow.
So it was like a lot of democracy, a lot of grassroots stuff. Uh-huh. And Evo Morales, the president, was having a very tough time with the United States and the UN. And so there was a lot of tension. And I think that the ambassador was about to get expelled. And so I come in, and what I've learned is that And it goes back to this hip hop connection. Growing up with that understanding of hip hop, I've had a passport to every community I've ever stepped foot on that transcended my U.S. passport or any other official title or role. I've been able to land on any street in the world, whether even an MS-13 community in San Salvador, land on the street, look up, and find my people and find a way and just connect. And so yeah, that's kind of how that work played out for me. But
well, San Salvador, El Salvador, you've have you ever felt unsafe in your official capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. You realize how thick bulletproof and armored vehicles are. So I've had the full escorts before. I would say the closest proximity to immediate danger was in Colombia. I was going to give a session of, I would also work with police and law enforcement of how to improve police-community relations from my New York experience taken into these other experiences. And I've worked with youth development. I've had all sorts of careers and jobs in my journey. And a few of the officers that were coming to the work session in the town that I was going to host in the evening were attacked with a grenade attack out of the city. So there was like some fatalities associated with people that were coming to one of the sessions. It was canceled that night. There was a heightened level of security. And so that, that kind of raises a lot of flags and a lot of what's going on. I never felt particularly unsafe, but I was also always felt deeply connected to community in a way that I felt like I would be all right. But bullets and grenades, they don't, when it starts going off, you could be in the wrong place, wrong time. I've been in places where there's been political coups. I was in Honduras when there was a political coup and the country got locked and military coup was taken over and people had to get out. So I've experienced that. Yeah.
It just seems like such a high adrenaline life. And now you're in Anchorage. So talk us through how, not that Anchorage can't have its own brand of high adrenaline, but it's definitely different.
It is different. When I first stepped foot here in 2007, I knew that it was special. I didn't know what role it would play in my life, but I knew that.
And why were you here that first time?
I came as a guest of the University of the Urban League, and I came as a hip-hop ambassador to work out with political literacy and young professionals. So I came to do the work that I do. And it turned into more projects. It turned into opportunities where I brought Alaskan artists with me on diplomatic missions. So I just kind of started building that connection. Someone said to me, I'll say it this way. They said, some people come to Alaska and they can stay. Other people come to Alaska and they try to stay, but they can't. And then they leave. And the difference in that is, how I interpreted that is how roots connect to you. Like people come to and they say often, I want to lay down my roots. Mm-hmm. When I first stepped foot here, I felt that there were roots coming from the ground, coming upwards, like even spiritual and energy roots coming upward toward me, saying, "You found us." Like, so there's always been this real draw here. And my wife traveled with me up here as an artist as well, so we got exposed.
And tell us about your wife. She's an artist as well.
She's an artist as well. She's a hospitality executive in the city right now.
She's a singer.
So we rapper.
Yeah, rapper.
MC, yeah, and so just a tremendous person. But Anchorage for me, when I first stepped foot here, had a special calling. I could see that the United States could learn from what Anchorage decides to do in a way that is very different than the leadership role that we imagine that culturally, like a place like New York has, that is so dominant. Mm-hmm. It's so dominant, but it's so fixed. Even the political structures are so old. They're older than the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. ratified I mean, New York ratified the U.S. Like, that's old. Alaskan's constitution is so young. I know Vic Fisher. You know Vic Fisher.
Yeah.
So what? You can meet a cat like that.
Mm-hmm.
The structures are still relatively young. Now, when you overlay that with indigenous wisdom, now you're getting into a depth there. But the point is, when that merges, that freshness and newness, we can learn how to not do it the same way others did it. I've always felt like Alaska could lead the way. And then for all intents and purposes, I'm an expatriate. I'd rather live internationally. I'd rather work internationally, if it's not for Anchorage. So this is my last U.S. city where I feel like my family wanted to invest our time, our talent, and raise our family here. Right.
So 14-year-olds, that's like 2009. Had y'all relocated to Anchorage?
We came full-time we were coming back and forth, doing work up here for 7-8 years.
Okay.
And then came full-time back in 14. Drove up we were in Florida for a year. I was finishing a book. Yeah. So we've been here since my son was 3 turning 4. Now he's 14 turning 15.
And does he consider himself an Alaskan? Does he feel like Alaska's home?
Yeah. He knows he was born overseas.
Where was he born?
Honduras.
Oh, interesting.
My wife is Garifuna, the Afro-Indigenous people, Honduras, Guatemala, Belize.
Okay.
So we have deep roots there. We own property. My son was born in Honduras. I lived in Honduras for 6 years I left New York full time, I'd say in 2004. Found myself occasionally back, so Occupy was there and I was back, but that was it happened to be that way. For the most part, I'd really become an expat until about 12 to 14, and then I really came to Anchorage.
Now, you said your mom had moved back to Puerto Rico. Do you go to Puerto Rico?
I haven't really been back in a while. My mother's come to here to visit, and we love the accessory dwelling unit changes.
Yeah.
We're talking on the phone regularly, and we're working it out now.
So that she can come here full time?
Yeah, and recently there's been some actions that we've even taken that I've learned about, more of the health related to certain conditions that as she's getting older, she's, kind of being, they're having to deal with. So we're looking at those options.
What surprised you most about being on the Anchorage Assembly? Having watched it forever and sort of being involved, once you're actually in, is there a surprise?
Generally speaking, no. I've had enough experience of political and government experience, and so just generally speaking, no. And then my 4 years in the administration, I have executive branch experience, so it's a different role. So it's a very different role in the legislative branch. But generally speaking, no, I feel very comfortable. The biggest surprise, though, is that people have asked me, is it as people, and they mean this, I think that I know what they're saying. They say, is it as bad as it looks from the outside? And what they're saying when they ask that, it tends to be about the administration. And they're like, is it as dysfunctional? Usually that's what people say. Is it as dysfunctional? And the answer is, that's the biggest surprise. It is more dysfunctional than it even appears from the outside. Up close, it's even more dysfunctional. Yeah.
Well, my political involvement in Anchorage stemmed from that mayoral election when Bronson won, and his first big announcement was a large mass homeless shelter at Elmore and Tudor, which is in Campbell Park, my community council, where I was on the community council. Yes. And I've been very involved. And it's interesting because, as you know from this past week, thank you for what you said and thank you for your vote. Our major fear in the very beginning was the talk of possibly 1,000 people inside a tent.
Yes.
And then, of course, we worked our butts off to get that number down.
Yes.
We did everything we could. And 150 was a number that the community councils in the area were more comfortable with. And
to share the burden, to be a part of
exactly. Right. Well, because as we knew, as I would always say, it's not about, it's better for the people that shelter's going to serve.
That's right.
I mean, really, people can say that I'm NIMBY for not wanting 1,000-person homeless shelter in my backyard, but it's not in those folks' interest.
It's not a good design. And so, no.
And to bring it forward for people who may not have been following recently, Mayor Bronson gave an interview in which he said he did not know where that 150 number came from, and that the structure that they had purchased could easily hold 776 individuals, and there were 775 on the street, and if he wanted to put everyone in there, he needed 776. He just, find me 776 beds, is what I heard when I listened to that interview. And that, to me, raised every alarm bell under the sun. That's what we've been fighting against for 2 years.
Zero innovation, zero creativity, 2 years of focusing on a losing plan.
One thing. That was the only
one thing, and not a good thing. It's not a one thing that's like a real solution. It's a one thing that has no practical applied arc of success. There's no 700 person low barrier shelter that's going to be successfully run in our community. When we had a 240 person shelter down at Brother Francis, it would swell in the wintertime to even more than that. Brother Francis, if you talk to the providers, and this is why, like,
it was overcrowded.
Where the municipality is not good at doing things that others do better. We are condition setters, and the mayor is trying to create a thing that no one can operate. You talk to the operators, they're all, that's too big. They wouldn't scale that size. And they've right-sized their programming so they could be more effective to the individual. So that's exactly right. And when we got down to that 150, it was, so that community, the communities area, the University Area Community Council too, all passed these resolutions basically saying that
Scenic Foothills as well.
We don't want to be, it's not a NIMBY question. It's about practical operational size and right sizing things. And it's also about citing where that is versus the resources and the infrastructure you need to support.
It's best
the program.
practice.
Correct. So it was bad on all sorts of fronts. Then they created the Hickle Hole lawsuit settlement. So it was like bad root, bad tree, bad fruit all around. And the philosophy of a warehousing people just isn't right.
Here is our guest speaking at the August 22nd, 2023 Anchorage Assembly meeting on the topic of Mayor Bronson's proposed mass shelter at Elmore and Tudor.
And let me just be clear about this as well. What a waste of time. Honestly, a waste of time and resources focusing so much energy, focusing so much attention on something that is, first of all, not being described honestly. To the words of the mayor, he wants a 1,000-person facility. It's not being described honestly to the public with respect to the funding sources where we want to draw from one-time funding sources that have been appropriated with values that this community holds important to it so that we can develop a building that doesn't have funding for operating. So we're essentially wanting to build, it's even more than hope. We want to build, or the proposal is to build a thing that would function, but we don't have funding to function it, nor do we have operators willing to step up to do this work as well. And let me share this directly. I think this is also driven by fear. I think the mayor, I think folks are afraid. I don't want to talk about specific choices that people made and their intentions, but I think fear drives the idea that we could just put people into a big box somewhere far away from where people are. I think that drives fear. And on my point, I didn't need the media to tell me this because I toured 3rd and the 3rd Avenue site with the health department, and I happened to have an opportunity to have the mayor there. And for a better part of an hour, I debated the mayor on the floor of the site, who kept trying to convince me that we could run a 1,000-person bed facility well. And I told the mayor, when has that happened well with 240 people? And let's look at the practices. Let's look at the operators. Why are we trying to lead this way? And on that note, where I really knew that there was a fear question here, the mayor said to me, he observed the drug deal go down in the camp. And I said to the mayor, well, what'd you do? And the mayor said, I I wouldn't have did it. I didn't do anything. And I told the mayor that ain't going to happen with me walking around today because we're here on official city business. We're going to hold people accountable. And he said, well, maybe that's the difference between where we're from. What I take that to mean is that maybe I'm around people more often.
I don't want to relitigate everything, but the other point that I'll make is when that proposal initially came forward, before Mayor Bronson was even sworn in, it was a complete surprise to everyone who lived in the vicinity. There had been no community discussion, conversation at all. And we immediately asked for it. And it took us a year before the administration came to talk about it with us. And they told us at that point, too much had already gone into it. To really, they were there to inform us. They weren't there to hear anything from us. It was really just an absolute exercise and a demonstration in what not to do.
And my conversation to the administration was, stop letting people die on the streets. You're the executive branch. Do the work it takes to build the cold weather infrastructure with the civil society partners to make sure that people are not dying in the streets. So do that. I will not be chasing you in that. Like that's your job, right? But the other side is, I told them, you've been meeting with different members trying to get them to move on this navigation thing. I told them it was a dead horse today, and I asked them, when will they stop trying to ride a dead horse so they can focus on turning the narrative? But as the administration, they're willing to say the number of people who have died in the streets as a data point to articulate some sort of, this is why they need the big shelter, rather than understand the human failure that they've allowed to happen. They don't see it that way. They're like, this is the political environment's fault that people are dying because we can't get this. And it's all bad ideas and cruelty. Because if you're really just not channeling bad ideas for 2 years, then you give an opportunity for the community to work with individuals every day, not losing hope, working with the civil society partners, Brother Francis and other of the small providers, and how do we get small scattered site model going across the community? And that's what our community councils in that area said they were willing to sign up for.
Exactly. And I liked the task force. I think they were the task force looking at sanctioned campgrounds. But when their representative came and spoke to Campbell Park, they said, I want to ask this community council to take a look at your area and find a space where you think it might be usable. In other words, I would like this community council to look at their area and find a solution. Because the problem that we've all run into over and over again is that, especially with something large, is that wherever you decide to put it, it feels unfair to that community. It feels like, why is the East Side being targeted again? Why are we being forced to? And so I think having people frame it in their frame of mind, like, we're all going to be part of the solution. What solution can we offer rather than what are we going to say no to and pull out every stop to stop? And I have appreciated that approach.
Yeah. I mean, I think it takes all of us to work on these challenges together. You know, one of the, I think, things that people should understand is that I don't think people should be thinking about solutions as much as, because it sounds like there's an end point. And the reality is that a lot of the systemic challenges, we're dealing with historic trauma, we're dealing with layers of trauma, and so it's much more complex. And
multi-factored. Yes. The price of housing, a house costing $100,000 more than it did 3 years ago, that plays an enormous role. People want to make it all about treatment.
That's right.
But the bottom line is that if you can't afford housing, that is an important factor, and there's no magic bullet for making housing affordable.
And a big old tent warehouse that won't hold a snow load. So you have 700 people into a tent that won't hold the snow load. That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. So Right. So that's the other. So that's like,
Yeah, that's the other part.
So that's the other part. And you know, so the first two things were that we needed to be clear about that, and I'm really happy that at least the Assembly spoke overwhelmingly, supermajority on that, to not fund that and to hopefully let that rest.
9-3.
9-3. But the other side is we really have to be in front of next year by creating conditions that people can move toward that are healthy, by creating different pathways for individuals to get the support and the aid that they may need. But just being in front of it, I feel like this administration has done two things. They have been incompetent and they have also been cruel. And the cruelty is they seem willing to let bad fester so that they can have a cynical political win of some sort. And I cannot stand that. I really can't. And I'm the type of person that with all the integrity of my experiences, I would go talk to them and say, hey, let's move into this direction and let's work on things together in this direction. But every opportunity that I see in the mayor's public comments is he goes back to the cynical political playbook, and it gets very difficult. The good news is that there are still some professionals sticking around the city. I salute them every chance we get. If there's a new appointment, there's a new director or acting director, people that have been around for multiple administrations, serving Republicans, Democrats, don't really matter. I'm a nonpartisan, so I care that people are focused on ideas. I'm progressive. There's no doubt about that, because I believe that we should be creating the conditions for success for vulnerable people, especially that have not had those opportunities. But we have to get past the cynical political playbook and really work on things that this community has vetted.
What I would like to do, I always ask people to recommend a book, but it just seems like a no-brainer that you need to plug your book again.
Hey, good. Yeah, I would. You can find it on a Kindle. I think.
What's it called again?
It's now, next year is the 10th anniversary of the publication, so the hard copies are not around. But it's called The Organic Globalizer: Hip-Hop, Political Development, and Movement Culture.
By George Martinez.
By George Martinez and Dr. Christopher Malone.
Hey, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Big thank you to Maya Narang for making this podcast listenable. And thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com. That's East Anchorage Book Club, all one word, @gmail.com.